In 1989, the residents of Canada's Miramichi became the target of a vengeful killer.
He was out to hurt a lot of people in this area.
He was almost like the boogeyman.
It was like we were chasing a ghost. It was like he could see us somehow, and we couldn't see him.
He struck with brutal ferocity.
They find one body, and then they find another body, and then they look around and they see, there's blood everywhere.
But what was the root of his inner fury?
I felt he was capable of anything. He just exuded evil.
And was he born to kill?
This person would have to be an animal, a person without any conscience.
The area, even we get new police officers here, they comment their arms get worn out from having to wave so often because the people are so friendly.
You know, it was just an ordinary community. It had its beautiful sights. It had the famous fishing rivers known all over the world.
Very quiet little town. People didn't lock their doors, and most kids went outside to play.
But in October 1989, this peaceful, child-friendly community was engulfed by fear.
There is no trick-or-treating in Newcastle tonight because this Halloween is like no other.
A masked killer had forced the residents off the streets.
You can't go out at night by yourself. And I never used to be scared to be home by myself, and now I'm scared.
The nighttime prowler had invaded people's homes and brutally ended the lives of 3 local women.
At night, people wanted to protect their family. Gun sales went way up.
Despite a huge manhunt, the killer had evaded capture for over 6 months.
The mood and the atmosphere was something that I've never seen before. He had the whole Miramichi area in total fear.
With seemingly no end to the bloodshed, petrified locals in Chatham Head would turn to the church and the comforting words of Father James Smith.
Father Smith was very well regarded in the community, very well known for his kindness.
He's a Roman Catholic priest in a Roman Catholic community. He lived in the rectory right next to the church. The church was right next to my grandmother's house. He was a significant figure in that community.
However, concerns would be raised one November night when the local priest failed to show up for a prayer meeting.
The parishioners went over to the rectory to see where he was. And they looked in the windows to see if they could see anything. They saw his body on the floor, saw scenes of a struggle, and lots of violence in the house.
Officer Mason Johnson would be called to the scene. As he entered the rectory, the full extent of the attack was plain to see.
I arrived at the scene, and he was lying there, and he was tortured. His neck was cut, his chest was cut, his jaw was broken.
They found just an exceptional degree of violence, and they found Father Smith badly beaten, and he had expired.
An autopsy would later reveal an even more shocking aspect to the killer's attack.
He had jumped on Father Smith and separated the ribs from the sternum.
To attack a clergyman in the middle of a small community like this, and for someone to come into his home and subject him to absolute violence and torture, I think any investigator really believes that this thing has gone over the ledge, and really there's no turning back now for whoever this is responsible for this.
Many of these people will barricade themselves in their homes tonight, praying for the nightmare to end.
As police took on board the 4th murder to hit the Miramichi in just 6 months, the sadistic nature of the crimes left them in no doubt what they were dealing with.
This person would have to be an animal. This person would have to be a person without any conscience.
And one name stood out above all others, a 41-year-old prisoner on the run, local man, Allan Legere.
You mentioned Allan Legere, everybody in the Miramichi knew the name Allan Legere.
He was violent, and sometimes it could be utterly unpredictable.
It's fair to assume that if anything bad happened, Allan Legere was part of it, or people said he was part of it.
And 3 years previously, the notorious Legere had been involved in a similarly brutal attack inflicted on elderly storekeepers John and Mary Glendenning.
The culprits had gone into the home and beaten them as part of a robbery. This was a robbery, obviously, that had gone bad.
Legere and his 2 accomplices had remained in the couple's home for a number of hours. Tragically, the brutal onslaught led to the death of John Glendenning, whilst his wife was left with horrific injuries.
If you could have seen her face and the beating that she took, I've never seen a woman display as much courage.
She went through a torture and a sexual assault. She was basically on her deathbed when she was brought to the hospital.
Although 3 men had been implicated, 38-year-old Allan Legere was identified as the ringleader with 2 young accomplices.
These young fellas weren't known for the violence that Legere was known for.
It's not the kind of thing that 18 and 19-year-olds would do. Even if they were after money, it went beyond what any kind of small-time criminal would be doing.
Legere was seen as the instigator, the leader, probably the planner, an older criminal working with 2 younger criminals.
Allan Legere was sentenced to life in prison. Once inside, he appeared to be willing to conform.
Very quickly, Allan Legere became a model prisoner once he got inside prison. No muss, no fuss, no trouble.
But despite his placid demeanour, Allan Legere was not intending to spend the rest of his days behind bars.
He observed the place, but most of all, what he did was build a rapport with the guards.
He was seeding the ground. He was looking for an opportunity where he could try to make a dash for it.
In May 1989, Legere put his master plan into action.
He took urine and he lay down and he put the urine in his left ear and his ear would get infected. So he eventually had to see a specialist. Now, to see a specialist, he knows he has to leave the institution.
Prison guards would accompany the notorious killer to a hospital in Moncton.
He had it all planned. He had the antenna from his television snapped off, hidden inside a cavity in his body. He had a makeshift key. He had a jacket that he was carrying to hide where his handcuffs were.
He was able to loosen his feet shackles and his handcuffs, but they did look like they were still on.
When Legere arrived at the hospital, he created an opportunity to separate himself from the accompanying guards.
He says, I've got to use the bathroom. He could convince them to let their guard down so that they would give him just that inch of leeway.
Of course, when they get in the washroom, it was only 10 seconds to take his handcuffs off.
Having freed himself, Legere then extracted the television antennae from his body.
He came out of the washroom, waving the TV aerial at the 2 guards like it was a weapon.
They don't have guns. All they've got is a bit of tear gas and a canister. And by the time they realize what's happening, he's headed out the door and they're trying to spray the back of his head with the tear gas. It was all planned.
As Legere attempted to flee the scene, he hastily made his way through the hospital car park. The first car he came to belonged to outpatient Peggy Olive.
Well, it all happened so quickly because he just opened the door and pushed me over. He said he was being held for murder, and the fact that he was holding something to my throat, and I thought, this is the end of my life. And everything sort of flashed through my mind.
Despite the situation, he doesn't seem to be running on adrenaline. He's running at a very calm pace. That's not what a normal person would be able to do.
With Legere at the wheel, Peggy would see more than one side to the convicted killer during her terrifying ordeal.
He'd be a bad guy, like threatening, and then try to be the nice guy. So his personalities were changing constantly. I felt he was capable of anything.
Despite her concerns, the carjacking would end without bloodshed.
When he did let me go, he said, oh, and I won't harm your car either. There was a feeling, he just exuded evil. It was this terrifying feeling you had. Even now, I can recall how I felt.
He gets her out of the vehicle, he takes the vehicle, he drives to a section of Moncton that he knows, he dumps the vehicle.
Despite a heightened state of alert, the fugitive would vanish into thin air. As the manhunt continued, many, including Miramichi police officer Bob Bruce, were convinced he would not return to his homeland.
We felt that he was so well known in this area that it would be almost like, why come back to someplace where I'm going to be arrested right away?
The assumption was, what do small town hoods do when they escape from prison? They disappear.
Little did we know that wasn't what was going to happen.
In May 1989, convicted killer Allan Legere was on the run following a brazen escape from a Moncton hospital. Although his whereabouts were unknown, his homeland of the Miramichi had been subjected to a campaign of murder, fueling rumours that the fugitive may have returned to the area. "41 years previously, in 1948, Allan Legere had been born in Chatham Head, a troubled neighbourhood on the banks of the Miramichi River.
You didn't bike through there, walk through there. It was a rough area to go to.
It was poor. There were homes there where it would have been very difficult to find enough to eat. It wasn't unusual for people to struggle to get enough to just keep their house warm in the winter.
As a single mother, Louise Legere rented out rooms in the family house to make ends meet. One of her lodgers would father her fourth child, Allan, before skipping town.
He grew up without any kind of father influence or father figure to look up to.
Allan's relationship with his mother was difficult. She was someone who wasn't terribly selective with her partners, and she would bring them into the home. And the walls probably weren't terribly well insulated. You'd be fully aware of the fact that she'd brought somebody into the house.
I don't think that Legere was a big fan of what his mother was doing. It was not something that he was proud of.
Adolescent boys need to see their mothers as asexual. It is very, very difficult for an adolescent boy to see their mother having sex, even with their father. But when an adolescent boy sees his mother in a very sexual way, it's enormously destabilizing in their psychosexual development.
As Allan Legere progressed through his early childhood, signs of inappropriate behaviour would start to surface.
He had to share a bedroom with his sister. And one of his, I think, strongest influences in his early life was watching his sister dress and undress. He had these sexual urges from an early age and used to watch her undress.
Outside the family home, Legere would divide opinion at school.
Some people really liked him and thought he had a lot of potential as an artist. And then there's others that thought he was just a horrible thug who was always involved in fights.
People who he liked felt that he was bright and had potential. People that he didn't like, they were afraid of him.
Legere's troubled childhood would ultimately be forged by a family tragedy when his elder brother was run over whilst walking over a local bridge. As his mother grieved, she would launch an extraordinary attack on her increasingly wayward younger son, Allan.
His mother had just told him point blank, "I wish it was you and not your brother."
Allan Legere's mother resented him.
And it wasn't only his family that was growing tired of his troublesome behaviour.
He wouldn't have been getting a lot of positive reinforcement inside the community.
I think it all just sort of weighed on him.
You can see where the scars would be.
"32 years later, in 1989, Allan Legere was a convicted killer on the run, having escaped custody during a hospital visit in Moncton. As he continued to evade capture, fears were growing that the fugitive may return home to the Miramichi, intent on revenge.
Many community people thought that Legere had a need to get back and pay people back for his conviction, feeling that he wasn't treated properly.
And they said, "We want you to get your family and put them somewhere." But they wouldn't leave home. They said, "No, if you're staying here, we're staying."
Despite concerns, 3 weeks would pass without incident. But then Officer Mole was called to a house fire in the community of Chatham.
So in 1989, this vacant lot, on the left-hand side, there would be a small grocery store, and on the second floor would have been Annie Flam's residence.
Annie had run the local store for a number of years.
Annie Flam was well known in the community. Sort of local kids would go there and buy candy at the store. She was sort of everybody's grandmother.
The popular 75-year-old was known to be close to her sister-in-law, Nina, who lived in the adjoining house.
Annie Flam and Nina were just pillars of the community. Everybody loved them.
The house fire was devastating, but despite the ferocity of the flames, Nina Flam had managed to survive.
The entire house had been destroyed by fire, and it was really a miracle that Nina herself had escaped the fire. However, the majority of her body, she was covered in 2nd and 3rd degree burns.
Despite her injuries, Nina was able to reveal to police that the fire was not accidental.
They knew from talking briefly with Nina Flam that they had a very serious assault that had taken place.
A masked intruder had initially demanded money, but had then subjected the elderly women to a prolonged attack before setting the building ablaze.
Nina Flam, he had tied her to the bed, strangled her. She had feigned death. So he left her for dead, and she was able to get her restraints off her feet. Her bed was totally engulfed at that point, and the room was in flames.
As investigators headed to the burnt-out first floor, they feared the worst for Nina's sister-in-law, Annie Flam.
Her remains were found in her bed with the covers tucked in. Didn't look as if she had gotten into bed voluntarily, it rolled over, like normally it would do, you go to bed. Had been tucked in by someone.
She had been brutally assaulted before the fire.
The subsequent autopsy revealed that she had been beaten, her jaw was broken.
The 75-year-old had also been sexually assaulted before her death.
She had expired on her own vomit because of the trauma of the injury. She did not die from smoke inhalation, it was actually the assault.
For no rhyme or reason, we could figure out why anybody would go in. We could figure out maybe in to rob them, but not to commit the violence against them that was so apparent.
He's targeting elderly victims because they're weak and they have very little ability to resist. That shows just how weak and inadequate he feels internally.
The profile of the elderly victims and signs of theft at the scene bore the hallmarks of the Glendenning murder, committed by Allan Legere 3 years previously.
We knew that he had escaped, but we had no evidence to say that he had actually come back to our area.
However, investigators would be forced to re-evaluate when victim Nina Flam recalled a particular detail from her terrifying ordeal. Her attacker had worn a chain around his midriff.
A belly chain or a waist chain is it's consistent with a prisoner. In the back of, I think, all of our minds, Legere was the prime suspect.
But without a single sighting, authorities had little to go on. As they desperately searched for leads, they were unaware that the bloodshed in the Miramichi had only just begun. In May 1989, the Miramichi suffered the brutal murder of 75-year-old storekeeper Annie Flam. With escaped killer Allan Legere rumoured to be in the area, fears were growing that the sadistic killing may have been the start of a random revenge campaign against the local community.
A lot of people thought, well, did I ever make him mad? You know, he might come looking for me.
He was out to hurt a lot of people in this area. I have one son and 3 daughters, and they were very intimidated.
Despite a heightened state of alert, the local terrain would hamper attempts to track him down.
I think the challenge for law enforcement in this area is that there's very dense woodland around the communities themselves.
The surrounding area is all something like this. So all our searches took us to areas that were very difficult to search.
Although there were still no sightings of Legere, many believed the convicted killer was stalking the neighbourhood under the cover of darkness.
Part of the community sense of what Legere was that he was almost like the boogeyman. People had to be careful what they said because they never knew if he was listening or not.
I could just feel Legere behind every bush. There's Legere, or just looking into the forest, you think, is he there somewhere watching like a specter, ghost? He's out there in the woods.
It was along that time frame when we were also starting to get some prowler complaints.
And one disturbed break-in offered up evidence that would be hard to ignore.
Gentleman came home, saw someone running through his backyard. He chased him. However, he was able to escape. The next day, the owner of the home went out and found a pair of eyeglasses.
We recovered them. They were prescription glasses, and they matched up to the same prescription glasses that Legere had been issued in prison.
Decades earlier, Allan Legere had been renowned as a wayward teenager in the Miramichi area. But despite his rebellious image, Legere felt his diminutive stature was holding him back.
He was small and he was skinny, and in a neighborhood like that one, if you were a bit lippy and talked too much, somebody would give you a slap upside the head. There was only one way to avoid that, which was to be big enough that they didn't dare do that to you.
Bodybuilding would fast become one of Allan Legere's lifetime passions.
He went to the gym pretty well every day. He was very muscular in his upper body, and he would walk around with a t-shirt on or a little undershirt or no shirt.
He had the particular way of walking, chest out, had that bodybuilder walk, and he made sure people knew who he was.
He wants to demonstrate to others how powerful he is, but he also wants to demonstrate to himself that he's not the weak, inadequate, inferior person that he really knows internally that he is.
Behind the scenes, Legere also took great pleasure in his own brand of petty crime.
He prided himself of being able to go into a house or a trailer with the people at home and steal what he wanted.
There were stories of people waking up and he was standing over them in the bed, basically just looking at them.
Those who didn't wake would soon find out Allan Legere had paid them a visit.
He'd always leave something behind to let the homeowner know that he had been there. He'd take out clothing and leave on the bed on top of the people that were sleeping.
He even cut the underwear off a female minister. He was quite proud of being able to do things like that.
He enjoyed feeling control and power because he didn't have much else. He didn't have the breaks in life that the Richies, as he used to call them, had.
Although Legere would live away from the area in Moncton, the focus of his crimes would remain on the Miramichi. As his break-ins escalated, police would find him hard to pin down as he went to extreme measures to cover his tracks.
He would take a hard-covered book, put it in the living room on the carpet, reach underneath and light the pages on fire. So that would work as a downdraft, almost like a stove. And he could take an hour and a half to drive from here to Moncton before the fire department got a call that the house was burning. And if they checked him in Moncton, 2 hours later, they're saying, but he's here.
7 years later, Allan Legere was a convicted killer on the run. Although he hadn't been cited, police suspected Legere had returned home on a revenge campaign and was potentially involved in the Chatham murder of 75-year-old Annie Flam.
People did not want to talk about Allan Legere. They were scared if they said something to me that they were going to get targeted. They did not want their name to appear in print, ever.
You could have a sighting of a prowler 2 nights back to back, and then there'd be a time frame of 2 weeks that there'd be absolutely nothing. And it was almost like a game for him. He became a master at eluding us.
For over 6 months, the Miramichi would suffer just minor crimes. But that would all change on the night of the 13th of October 1989 in the community of Newcastle.
Someone was walking by and saw flames coming from the home of Linda and Donna Donnie.
Linda, 41, and Donna, 45, were both popular members of their close-knit community.
The Donnie sisters were an unmarried pair of sisters that lived in the former town of Newcastle.
Having investigated the arson attack and brutal murder carried out at the Flam residence, Officer Mole would try to remain objective as he approached the scene.
They notified us that they had had a fire, that there had been casualties. You didn't want to jump straight to the fact that this is another homicide case tied to the one in Chatham.
However, when the investigator entered the building, the horrific scene that lay before him left little doubt that the twisted killer had struck again.
I went inside. Just the degree of violence throughout the house was just incredible.
And they find one body, and then they find another body, and then they look around and they see, there's blood everywhere.
The fire, police say, was deliberately set to hide evidence of a grisly double murder.
The attacker had gone into the house, had brutally beaten both of those girls, had sexually assaulted them, badly, badly beaten, broken bones. The cause of death was strangulation and blunt trauma caused by severe blows to the head.
I saw both Donnie's sisters, photographs. Wow, scary that somebody could do that to someone.
This is the man everyone is afraid of finding on the doorstep.
You just wonder, how could somebody be so aggressive and brutal to other people, way beyond what is necessary to kill the person? He wants to destroy things. He wants to destroy people. If someone had a house or an attachment to the house, destroy it.
The DNA analysis identified Allan Legere, that it was his genetic material that was left at both of those crime scenes.
And with no specific vendettas against the victims, it appeared that anyone in the Miramichi was a potential target.
It was that moment with that report, I think, that we began the descent into what would be full-scale panic.
Allan Legere is to be considered one of the most dangerous and wanted criminals in Canada.
Everyone knew that Allan Legere was out hunting after dark.
They were scared of prowlers, so your normal streetlights, which are pretty well on every second corner, people were actually hiring streetlights in front of their home, behind their home, so that their home would be totally illuminated in the darkness. The lights got nicknamed Legere lights after Allan Legere.
I used to put sticks in my windows, so you had to break glass to get in my house. A couple of times police officers showed up on my lawn with dogs, and they said the dog trailed them right to my back door.
A massive manhunt would focus its search at night, but Legere's knowledge of the area made him an elusive adversary.
These wooded areas were sort of like Allan Legere's playground. He was very familiar with them. This is the areas where he grew up in. We would come to a fence like this where we would have to climb over it. He always seemed to know where the holes were in the fence line so he could go through it.
On a rare occasion, when Officer Bruce came close to capturing the fugitive, he discovered they were dealing with an armed assailant.
It was one of the darkest nights I can ever remember working. It was pitch black, and we were actually at a run down these tracks. We must have got fairly close because we heard a gunshot and at the same time saw a muzzle flash. And we immediately dove off this track bed into the ditches on both sides of it to avoid being shot at. After the first shot was fired, it was just duck and continue running. The second one was duck and don't get back up because we could not see anything to hit, to even shoot at. It was like we were chasing a ghost. It was like he could see us somehow and we couldn't see him.
As the killer disappeared into the night, many felt he was in complete control.
I think there was a sense in the community that Allan Legere was rubbing his hands in glee, that he had us where he wanted us.
As the search continued, those who had lived alongside Legere in his adult years would recall more than one side to the former Miramichi resident.
He had a personality that seemed to draw people in. I've talked to many, many people over the years that met him and say, my God, was he ever nice. He helped with the dishes, and he was just the nicest guy in the world.
He was a little bit dangerous, a little bit exciting. He married, he had kids. It looked like he was going to somehow find his way into sort of at least the lower middle class. And yet he couldn't seem to hold that together.
He wanted to be perceived as someone strong and powerful and competent. And he tried to even convince himself of that. But his feelings of inferiority were just too overpowering for him. And so he constantly tried to compensate.
Increasingly out of work, Allan Legere would look to make his mark in other ways.
I think if you're a reasonably bright person who's stuck on the wrong side of the tracks and you're looking for a way to sort of right that wrong, if you become known as fearsome, that gives you the right to swagger into a room. And I think Allan Legere desperately wanted it, and he'd found an avenue that allowed him to become the person inside the community that he felt he always should have been.
He definitely wanted the community to know who he was.
He had very piercing eyes. And when he talked to you, he liked to get right up close, which would intimidate you into stepping back a step.
He was unpredictable in a way that people didn't understand. And once he went off, there were no limits, there were no bounds.
Legere's animosity would become increasingly extreme as he targeted other elements of the Miramichi community.
He expressed his disdain for the Catholic Church, and then he would go on about the gold, the wealth of the Catholic Church, and then he would scare me. He would go in quoting verses, satanic verses. Oh, it chills up my back.
3 years later, in December 1989, Father James Smith would become the fourth victim of a sadistic killing spree. Having linked Legere to 3 of the murders, police were convinced the fugitive had perpetrated the latest crime.
We were sure at this particular point that when the priest was killed, there was no doubt that Allan Legere was responsible.
It just seemed like this was the ultimate crime to really punish the community for whatever reason.
After the killing of Father Smith, there was a recognition that we were the hunting ground, that he was hunting us.
And as before, Allan Legere had disappeared without trace and was free to kill again. In 1989, escaped fugitive Allan Legere was the prime suspect in the murders of 4 Miramichi residents. Having evaded capture for more than 6 months, the elusive killer had just fled the scene of Father Smith's murder and was known to have boarded a train to Quebec when it was searched by police.
The police did walk up to him, and they were told to look for a tattoo of an eagle on one of the shoulders. They asked him if he would mind rolling up his sleeve. And in that supernatural calm that he seemed to be able to call upon in situations like this, he pulled up his sleeve. There was no eagle on his arm. They had the wrong arm.
Having foiled authorities once more, the fugitive had freedom in his sights.
He made it to Montreal, and he managed to pawn off some jewelry that he had stolen from the Donny sisters. You know, he had money now, so where was he going to go?
But despite the obvious risks, Legere then made an extraordinary U-turn.
Most people, you think, in his situation would just keep going, try to get out of the country, but why would you want to even just think of going back to the Miramichi? But Allan Legere doesn't think like other people.
He hijacked a trucker and headed east, which is back towards the Miramichi. And so everybody was made aware.
We did have roadblocks set up with the RCMP. It was one of the roadblocks that actually caught him.
Although Legere had eventually been cornered, he was holding the truck driver captive at gunpoint.
There was a discussion that he would fight to the death. And I said, no, he's a coward. He's going to give himself up.
Allan Legere comes out of the truck and basically says, yeah, it's me, you got me. He surrendered quietly, meekly, no muss, no fuss.
Legere only wants to display his violence and aggression where he knows he can win. He'll do it with an elderly woman or someone who's weak and disabled in some way. Then he'll show how violent he is. But with armed police officers, no, he'll just give up and end it right there.
News of Legere's arrest would offer huge relief to the Miramichi community.
It was like a dream come true. Finally, he's in custody. There was jubilation after he was taken into custody.
Partway through the day, I heard church bells ringing, and I realized that the church bells were ringing not because it was noon, but because Allan Legere had been captured.
It was a huge relief. It was a huge relief to me. Like, that's the happiest story I ever wrote in my life.
2 years later, Allan Legere would be found guilty of 4 counts of first-degree murder. The witness statement provided by survivor Nina Flam would play a major role in his conviction.
Anyone listening to her testimony really felt for the situation that she was in, not only that night in that room, but what she suffered since and how she's had to deal with it.
As life finally returned to normal for the residents of the Miramichi, many were left wondering why one of their own had waged such a brutal war on their community.
Mr. Legere always thought people were out to get him. Prosecutors, police officers, the average person, that's just the way he was.
He lived a fairly disadvantaged life as a young person in the community, saw what other people had, and in committing these crimes, I think he saw it as an opportunity to kind of get even.
But was it just Allan Legere's challenged upbringing that sparked his murderous campaign? Or was he born to kill?
Allan Legere was born a psychopath. I think it's a mental disorder he was born with, and he doesn't have any conscience. Now, if we do something wrong, we've got a conscience. But Allan Legere showed no caring and no remorse.
I wouldn't say he was necessarily a born killer, but he certainly had these predispositions, and they emerged. And he just felt so weak inside that he just was living his whole life to compensate for it and to let people think that he was something other than what he really is.
Lots of people grow up with hard knocks in their lives, and people go through horrible things when they're young, but they don't go out and kill people. So he had to have it in him from birth to kill, because how else would you explain it?
Decades later, Allan Legere's reign of terror is now an horrific chapter from the past. But the community of the Miramichi is yet to erase this brutal killer from its memory.
Obviously, the family members that were victims, the relatives, the community itself is scarred. A lot of turmoil, and they'll never forget. But as a community, we will survive and hopefully be better from it.
Allan Legere makes news every time his name is mentioned. He still frightens people. It's raw. They are convinced, decades after he did it the first time, that if he gets out, he would do it again.
And those who knew him well are convinced that the convicted killer has only one thing on his mind.
He called me from the pen. He wanted to speak to me. He wanted his television back. So I said, has that television been searched the way it should have been? Well, we think so. I said, well, you better search it again, because there's a reason he wants his TV back. So they looked into the TV again, and they found a couple more handcuff keys. He started then planning his next escape.
I'm sure he's thinking about it right now. I'm sure he doesn't pass a minute of his day without thinking about getting back to that community and how he can do it.
The phone rings at 2:17 a.m., slicing through the silence like a blade, and somewhere in a quiet Ohio town that never expected to make national headlines, a detective stares at the blinking light and feels something shift in his chest, because this call is not routine, not paperwork, not another dead end, but a name, one name, that hasn't been spoken out loud in nearly 20 years, a name buried under dust, rumor, and fear, a name tied to a cold case everyone learned to stop asking about. Outside, the street is empty, the air heavy, and the past is suddenly awake again. In 2005, this town looked ordinary enough to pass through without slowing down. 2-lane roads. Modest houses. Front porches with cracked paint. A place where neighbors waved, where high school football mattered, where nothing ever seemed big enough to make the news. That illusion shattered the morning she vanished. No warning. No struggle witnessed. No goodbye. Just a routine day that fractured into before and after, a disappearance that would poison the years that followed. The headlines came fast at first: mysterious disappearance, young woman missing, family pleads for answers, and then, slowly, they faded, replaced by silence and speculation. The house was still warm when police arrived. Coffee cooling in a mug. Keys on the counter. A half-written note that meant nothing and everything. There were no signs of forced entry, no shattered glass, no blood on the floor. Just absence. The kind that feels deliberate. Calculated. Terrifying. Investigators walked room to room, photographing the ordinary, hoping for something extraordinary to jump out at them. It didn't. What they found instead was a void, and in that void, the first whisper of a cold case was born. Neighbors talked. They always do. One heard a car late at night. Another thought they saw someone standing near the driveway. A third swore the porch light flicked on around midnight. Statements stacked up, inconsistent and fragile, collapsing under scrutiny. Tips flooded in, then contradicted each other. Every lead seemed to point in a different direction, until none of them pointed anywhere at all. The town watched police tape flutter in the wind and waited for certainty that never came. Her name became a ritual in local news. Said carefully. Repeated softly. A photograph reused until the edges blurred. Candlelight vigils formed small circles of hope that flickered against the dark. Friends described her laugh, her habits, the way she always showed up early. Family members pleaded on camera, voices shaking, asking for one honest phone call, one piece of truth. But the phone stayed silent. Days turned into weeks. Weeks into months. And the case slipped into that uncomfortable category everyone fears, unsolved. Detectives worked the angles they always do. The inner circle first. Friends. Co-workers. Former partners. Anyone who might have had motive or opportunity. Alibis were checked, rechecked, then quietly shelved. Backgrounds were pulled. Stories compared. Nothing cracked. Evidence was thin, almost insulting in its emptiness. A few fibers. Partial prints that led nowhere. A timeline full of holes. Every theory collapsed under its own weight. And yet, unease lingered. Because disappearances like this don't happen in a vacuum. Someone had to know something. Someone had to have seen something. Someone had to be lying. The town began to change in subtle ways. Doors locked earlier. Curtains drawn tighter. Parents walked their children to school even in daylight. Conversations lowered when unfamiliar cars passed by. Trust, once assumed, became conditional. People started replaying old memories in their heads, reinterpreting casual moments with the sharp edge of hindsight. That friendly wave. That awkward pause. That neighbor who always seemed to be watching. Ordinary interactions took on a darker shape. As months turned into years, the investigation thinned. Files grew thicker but colder. Detectives were reassigned. New cases demanded attention. The missing woman's name drifted toward the back of filing cabinets and the back of minds, resurfacing only on anniversaries or during slow news cycles. The phrase, cold case, began to attach itself, quietly at first, then permanently. A label that felt like a verdict. But cold did not mean forgotten. Behind closed doors, her family never stopped pushing. They called. They wrote letters. They asked for updates that rarely came. They learned the language of investigations, the patience of people forced to live without closure. Each holiday arrived like a reminder of absence. Each birthday felt like a question with no answer. Hope thinned, but it never vanished completely. It hardened instead, becoming something sharper, more painful. Years passed. Technology changed. Databases expanded. Old evidence was boxed, then unboxed again. A new generation of investigators looked at the file with fresh eyes, unburdened by the assumptions of the past. They noticed small things others had dismissed. A timeline that didn't quite add up. A statement that shifted slightly depending on who was asking. A name that appeared too often at the edges of reports, always present, never central. The town barely noticed when the case was quietly reopened. There were no press conferences. No flashing lights. Just a few unmarked cars. A few interviews conducted behind closed doors. A few doors knocked on long after people assumed no one would ever knock again. Whispers began to move through the community, slow and uncertain. Something was happening. Something old was being stirred. Then came the rumors. Someone had talked. Someone had cracked. Someone had finally said the wrong thing. The word arrest floated through conversations like a forbidden spell. Most dismissed it. They had heard this before. False alarms. Dead ends dressed up as hope. But this time felt different. This time, law enforcement wasn't denying anything. Late one evening, patrol cars rolled quietly through familiar streets, not with sirens, but with purpose. A door was approached. A porch light flicked on. A figure appeared, older now, heavier, grayer, carrying the weight of years no one else could see. Neighbors watched from behind blinds as handcuffs clicked shut, the sound sharp, final, impossible to ignore. The name that followed shocked even those who thought they knew every secret this town held. It wasn't the drifter. Not the stranger. Not the shadowy outsider everyone had once feared. It was someone woven into the fabric of daily life, someone whose face had never raised alarms, someone who had stood close enough to the story to be invisible. The kind of arrest that makes people replay entire decades in their minds, searching for missed signs, forgotten moments, uneasy instincts they once ignored. By morning, the headline spread fast. Ohio 2005 cold case breakthrough. Police announce arrest that no one expected. Phones buzzed. Radios repeated it. Social feeds erupted. Shock traveled faster than facts. The community woke to a reality that felt unreal, as if the past had reached forward and grabbed the present by the throat. But answers did not come easily. Authorities released little. Just enough to confirm what had happened, not enough to explain how or why. The evidence, they said, was complex. Long in the making. Built quietly over time. Old material re-examined. New analysis applied. Statements revisited. Patterns reconsidered. A puzzle slowly reassembled after years of being scattered. And beneath the official language, beneath the careful phrasing, something darker pulsed, the suggestion that the truth had been closer than anyone wanted to admit. That the monster people feared had not come from outside town limits, but had lived among them, smiled among them, blended in seamlessly. As cameras gathered outside the courthouse and reporters whispered into microphones, one question hung in the air, heavy and unresolved. How does a secret survive for nearly 2 decades without breaking? How does a crime remain hidden in plain sight? And how many people, knowingly or not, helped keep it buried? The arrest did not bring relief. It brought shock. It reopened wounds. It forced old memories to resurface, sharper now, more accusatory. People began to talk again, this time with urgency. Old rumors resurfaced. Half-forgotten arguments were remembered in detail. Offhand comments took on new meaning. Everyone seemed to have a story they hadn't told before. And somewhere at the center of it all was the same empty space left behind in 2005, the same unanswered question echoing through every hallway and headline. What really happened on the night she disappeared? And how had the truth managed to hide for so long? The case was no longer cold. but it was far from resolved. What investigators were uncovering hinted at layers of silence, of fear, of carefully maintained normalcy. Each revelation threatened to unravel more than just a single crime. It threatened to expose a community's collective blind spot. And as the accused sat in custody, expression unreadable, the town held its breath, realizing that the story it thought it knew was only the surface. Beneath it lay something far more disturbing, something that had waited patiently for time, technology, and one final mistake to bring it into the light. The cold case had awakened. And it was only just beginning to speak. The arrest didn't bring silence. It triggered noise, low at first, then swelling, spreading through kitchens, garages, break rooms, and late-night phone calls. In a town trained by years of uncertainty, certainty felt almost violent. People argued over the name now circulating everywhere, testing it aloud like a dangerous word, rolling it around to see if it still fit the face they remembered. Some refused to believe it. Others said it made terrible sense. The past, once frozen, had begun to move again, and it was dragging everyone with it. Back in 2005, no one had looked twice at him. He was present but unremarkable, visible but forgettable. The kind of person who slips through memory, because nothing about him demands attention. He lived close enough to matter, far enough to avoid suspicion. He appeared in early reports only in passing, a footnote among many names, quickly dismissed. Investigators had spoken to him, logged his answers, checked a box, and moved on. At the time, there was nothing to hold on to. No motive they could prove. No physical evidence tying him to the disappearance. Just a vague sense of proximity, easily overshadowed by louder theories. Now that same proximity felt radioactive. When detectives reopened the cold case years later, they weren't looking for a miracle. They were looking for fractures. Tiny inconsistencies time tends to reveal. Statements that age poorly. Details that drift. And as they replayed old interviews, one voice began to stand out, not because it was dramatic, but because it was too controlled, too polished, too rehearsed. Answers delivered without hesitation. Timelines recited like lines learned by heart. It wasn't what he said. It was how little he ever seemed to struggle to say it. The new team approached the file differently. They didn't chase the loudest theory. They mapped relationships. They reconstructed routines. They asked who had opportunity not just once, but repeatedly. Who knew the rhythms of the victim's life? Who could move unnoticed? Who would have been trusted enough to avoid raising alarm? Slowly, a pattern emerged, faint but persistent, like a fingerprint surfacing through dust. Technology did the rest. Evidence once considered useless was pulled from storage. Fibers. Partial prints. Old swabs sealed in envelopes yellowed by time. Advances in forensic analysis gave voice to things that had been silent for years. What once produced inconclusive results now whispered possibilities. A partial match here. A narrowed pool there. Nothing definitive on its own, but together they formed a shape investigators couldn't ignore. Meanwhile, detectives began knocking on doors again. Awkward conversations followed. People who thought they were done being questioned found themselves sitting across from officers once more, trying to remember details from a lifetime ago. Memories stumbled forward, incomplete, but emotionally charged. Some grew defensive. Others strangely relieved, as if they had been waiting for someone to finally ask the right questions. And then there were the contradictions. A time that didn't line up. A detail that changed depending on who was listening. A casual remark made years ago that suddenly sounded different when replayed in a new context. Investigators compared transcripts line by line, listening not just for lies, but for evolution. Truth, they knew, tends to stay still. Lies shift. The suspect was brought in again, this time under a different tone. Not accusatory. Curious. Calm. The room was quiet, the lighting neutral, the recorder humming softly on the table. He looked older now, less sure of himself. The confidence that once coated his words had thinned. He spoke slowly, cautiously, choosing each sentence as if stepping across ice. When asked about that night in 2005, his story surfaced again, familiar, but not identical. Small details drifted. Times blurred. Explanations stretched. Detectives let the silence do its work. Outside the interview room, pressure built. Analysts pieced together movement patterns, cell tower pings, fragments of data that hadn't existed, or hadn't been usable, years earlier. A window of time narrowed. A path formed. Not a straight line, but a corridor of probability. Enough to justify a warrant. Enough to move forward. When the arrest finally came, it was quiet by design. No spectacle. No warning. Just procedure. The click of cuffs echoed louder than any siren could. Word spread anyway. It always does. By sunrise, the town was awake and reeling. Faces appeared on porches. People stared at their phones. Some cried. Some swore. Some said nothing at all. The shock wasn't just about who had been arrested. It was about proximity. About realizing how close the darkness had been. How many ordinary moments had unfolded in its shadow. People replayed conversations, holidays, shared glances, wondering what they'd missed. Wondering if they'd ever really known the person now at the center of the storm. Yet even as the headlines screamed breakthrough, uncertainty lingered beneath the celebration. Because an arrest is not an answer. It's a beginning. And the deeper investigators dug, the more complicated the story became. There were gaps. Uncomfortable ones. Missing hours. Unaccounted movements. Questions about motive that refused to settle into a single, clean explanation. The relationship between the suspect and the victim, once thought distant, now appeared more layered. Intersections surfaced, small, seemingly harmless overlaps that now pulsed with implication. Shared spaces. Shared acquaintances. Shared moments no one had thought important at the time. And then there were the witnesses who came forward late. Very late. People who had carried fragments of information for years, unsure, afraid, or convinced it didn't matter. One recalled an argument overheard long ago. Another remembered a vehicle parked where it shouldn't have been. Another admitted to dismissing a strange comment as a joke. Individually, none of it proved anything. Together, they formed a troubling chorus. The case began to feel less like a mystery waiting to be solved and more like a truth that had been actively avoided. Law enforcement remained careful with their words. They spoke of significant developments and ongoing investigation. They emphasized process, evidence, due course. But behind the restraint, momentum was undeniable. The file, once dormant, now pulsed with activity. Phones rang constantly. Analysts worked late. Boxes were reopened. Old photographs were examined under new light. For the family, the arrest reopened wounds they had learned to live around. Relief mixed with fear. Hope collided with dread. Because with answers come details, and details can hurt. They prepared themselves for revelations they might not want to hear, bracing for truths that could shatter the version of the past they had clung to for survival. The community, too, struggled to reconcile the narrative. Some rallied behind the arrest, convinced justice was finally within reach. Others urged caution, wary of rushing to judgment after so many years. Divisions formed quietly, then loudly. Online forums flared. Conversations grew heated. The cold case, once a shared sorrow, became a fault line. And through it all, one question refused to settle. How had this remained hidden for so long? The answer, it seemed, lay not in one dramatic failure, but in 1,000 small ones. Assumptions. Trust. Limited tools. Human error. The belief that evil looks a certain way, acts a certain way, announces itself. This case suggested otherwise. It suggested that evil can be mundane, patient, capable of waiting. As the accused sat behind bars awaiting the next steps, investigators pressed forward, knowing the hardest part was still ahead. Building a case strong enough to withstand scrutiny, to survive cross-examination, to transform suspicion into proof. The past had finally spoken, but it spoke in fragments, riddles, half-truths. And somewhere beneath the noise of headlines and speculation, beneath the shock and the disbelief, the original question still pulsed, unresolved and relentless. What truly happened in 2005, in that quiet Ohio town, on the night someone vanished without a trace? The answer, whatever it was, remained just out of reach, close enough to feel, distant enough to haunt, and the cold case, though awakened, was far from finished. The deeper investigators pushed, the more the past resisted, like a locked door swollen by years of moisture, refusing to open cleanly. Every fact they touched seemed to splinter into two versions, every memory into a contradiction. What had once looked like a simple disappearance now revealed layers, overlapping timelines, intersecting lives, and a quiet choreography of moments that only made sense when viewed from a distance. In 2005, the night she vanished had been described as unremarkable. Too ordinary to remember clearly. That was its greatest defense. People recalled weather but not hours. Sounds but not sequences. The mind, eager to protect itself, smoothed over gaps with assumptions. Investigators now peeled those assumptions away, one by one, exposing raw uncertainty underneath. They reconstructed the day from the ground up. Morning routines. Afternoon errands. Conversations overheard. Receipts time-stamped, receipts long forgotten in drawers. A stop at a local store. A brief phone call. A familiar route home. Each detail pinned to a board, connected with thread, adjusted, reconnected. Slowly, a narrow window of time began to form, a window in which everything had to have happened. And inside that window, one figure kept reappearing. Not dramatically. Not as a villain. Just there. Nearby. Close enough to intersect paths. Close enough to notice things others wouldn't. Close enough to act without drawing attention. In 2005, that proximity had been invisible. In hindsight, it glowed. Detectives revisited early witness statements with a forensic patience that bordered on obsession. They listened to old recordings, their ears trained now for hesitation, for subtle changes in tone. They read transcripts aloud, line by line, comparing them to newer interviews. What they found was not a single lie, but a slow drift. Details bending. Timelines stretching. Answers growing more careful, more guarded. Truth, when repeated, tends to simplify. Lies tend to complicate. One statement in particular began to stand out. A casual remark made early in the investigation, dismissed as irrelevant at the time. It concerned a brief encounter, a moment so ordinary it barely registered. Yet years later, when aligned with phone data and reconstructed movement patterns, that moment suddenly carried weight. It placed the suspect somewhere he had previously claimed not to be. Not definitively. Not dramatically. But enough to raise a quiet alarm. Investigators followed that thread backward, tracing connections through acquaintances, co-workers, overlapping routines. They discovered subtle overlaps that had never been charted together before. Shared spaces. Shared schedules. Shared silences. The kind of intersections that seem meaningless until you realize how rarely coincidence repeats itself. Meanwhile, forensic specialists re-examined physical evidence that had sat untouched for years. Items once labeled inconclusive were run through updated systems, cross-referenced against expanded databases. The process was slow, meticulous, almost reverent. These fragments were relics now, artifacts from a moment frozen in time. Each held the possibility of revelation, or disappointment. Results came back in stages. Partial. Incomplete. But suggestive. A trace that narrowed a field. A pattern that reduced uncertainty. Not enough to declare certainty, but enough to justify pressure. Enough to justify questions that could no longer be brushed aside. The suspect was brought in again. This time, the room felt different. The air heavier. The silence more deliberate. Years had changed him. Age had softened his posture, but sharpened his defensiveness. He answered politely, almost politely enough to seem rehearsed. His eyes flicked toward the door more often now. He asked how long this would take. He asked whether he needed a lawyer. He asked questions that revealed anxiety without admitting it. Detectives asked him to walk through that night again. Slowly. Carefully. From the moment he woke up to the moment he went to bed. At first, the story flowed. Familiar. Comfortable. But as the minutes stretched on, cracks began to show. A pause where there hadn't been one before. A correction that contradicted an earlier version. A detail added, then quietly retracted. His timeline began to fray, thread by thread. They didn't accuse. They didn't confront. They simply let the inconsistencies sit in the room, heavy and unspoken. Silence can be more destabilizing than any accusation. Outside the interview room, analysts compared notes in real time. A timestamp here didn't match a claim there. A movement overlapped with another witness's account. A phone ping suggested presence where absence had been insisted upon. None of it was explosive on its own. Together, it formed pressure. And pressure changes behavior. When the interview ended, the suspect left visibly shaken. He had not confessed. He had not been arrested. But something had shifted. The mask had slipped, if only for a moment. Detectives knew it. So did he. Word of renewed activity began to leak again. A former neighbor called in with a memory that had bothered them for years. Another person reached out anonymously, referencing an argument long forgotten. Someone else mentioned seeing a vehicle parked in a strange place, at a strange hour, back when no one thought to write it down. The past, once sealed, was cracking open. Each tip was fragile. Unreliable. Potentially contaminated by time and media. But investigators treated them all the same, carefully, skeptically, methodically. They were not chasing a story. They were assembling a structure strong enough to hold scrutiny. Still, doubts lingered. Some within the department worried about tunnel vision. About the danger of seeing what you want to see. About the weight of expectation pressing down on every decision. A cold case reopened carries its own gravity. Solving it becomes more than a goal, it becomes a promise. And promises can distort judgment. But there was something else now. Something harder to ignore. A pattern of behavior emerged, stretching beyond the disappearance itself. Subtle signs of control. Of volatility. Of moments others had once dismissed as quirks or stress. Retold through a new lens, these stories felt different. Darker. More deliberate. A history of crossed boundaries that had never quite risen to the level of alarm until now. The investigation widened carefully, branching into years that followed 2005. Not to accuse, but to understand. To see whether the disappearance was an isolated rupture, or part of a longer, quieter arc. What they found was not a trail of violence, but a pattern of unease. Complaints that went nowhere. Tensions smoothed over. Incidents minimized. A reputation for being difficult, intense, off, but never dangerous. Until suddenly, retrospect demanded a harsher word. As scrutiny intensified, the suspect's world began to contract. Friends distanced themselves. Conversations ended abruptly. Doors that had once been open closed quietly. The community, once unsure what to believe, began to lean toward a darker interpretation. Not out of malice, but because too many pieces were beginning to align. And still, no body had been found. That absence loomed over everything. Without it, the case hovered in a painful in-between, suspended between suspicion and proof. Prosecutors knew this. They moved cautiously, aware that emotion could not replace evidence. That a narrative, no matter how compelling, must stand on facts. Behind the scenes, pressure mounted. The public wanted answers. The family wanted closure. The media wanted confirmation. And investigators wanted to be right, because being wrong after all this time would mean reopening old wounds for nothing. Then came a development no one expected. A piece of information surfaced from outside the original circle. Not a confession. Not a witness. Something quieter. A record. A detail buried in an archive, overlooked because no one had thought to connect it before. It didn't point directly to a crime, but it reframed a timeline in a way that changed everything. Suddenly, a gap closed. A window narrowed. A possibility hardened into probability. The case team moved fast, aware that momentum like this doesn't last. Warrants were drafted. Requests approved. Files updated. The machinery of justice began to turn with renewed urgency. And through it all, the memory of the missing woman remained strangely present, as if the investigation itself were orbiting her absence. Her photograph sat pinned to the board, unchanged, untouched by time. The face everyone had been fighting for. The reason the case refused to die. As preparations were made for the next step, a quiet realization settled in among the investigators. Whatever happened next would redefine the story forever. Either the truth would finally surface, or the case would fracture under its own weight. Outside, the town waited again, holding its breath as it had so many years before. The same streets. The same houses. But nothing felt the same anymore. Because now, the question was no longer whether someone knew what happened. The question was how long they had managed to live with it. And somewhere ahead, just out of sight, the past was about to push back harder than anyone expected. By the time the warrants were signed, the case had crossed an invisible line. What had once been a cautious reinvestigation was now an active pursuit of truth, and everyone involved could feel the weight of it. The file was no longer dormant. It was alive, growing heavier with each added page, each annotation, each late-night discovery that refused to stay quiet. The first searches were methodical, almost surgical. No spectacle. No leaks. Just quiet movements authorized by ink and signatures. Investigators entered spaces that had not been examined in nearly 2 decades, places that had aged, changed ownership, been repainted, repurposed, lived in. Ordinary rooms with ordinary furniture, now treated as potential crime scenes long after anyone believed they ever were. They worked slowly, deliberately, knowing time had erased much, but not everything. Floors were scanned. Old storage areas reopened. Boxes untouched for years were unpacked. Dust rose into the air like memory itself being disturbed. Every object was photographed, bagged, logged. Even items that seemed absurdly mundane were handled with care. In cold cases, meaning often hides in the unremarkable. And then, quietly, something shifted. It wasn't dramatic. No sudden discovery. No moment that made anyone gasp. Just a subtle alignment of details that began to lean in the same direction. A trace that matched a range narrower than before. A pattern that no longer felt coincidental. A timeline that finally made sense when one assumption was removed. Investigators revisited digital records from the early 2000s, primitive by today's standards, fragmented and incomplete. Old phone logs. Archived billing data. Early location pings that had once been too imprecise to matter. Now, combined with witness recollections and movement analysis, they suggested proximity at a crucial moment. Not proof, but proximity with purpose. The suspect's story, when laid beside this reconstructed timeline, began to sag under its own weight. He had said he was elsewhere. Said he couldn't have been there. Said he didn't remember certain details, because nothing unusual had happened. But the data suggested otherwise. Not definitively, not yet, but persistently. A quiet contradiction that refused to go away. When confronted again, his demeanor changed. Not explosively. Not dramatically. Subtly. The calm he had once worn like armor began to slip. His answers shortened. His gaze wandered. He asked for breaks. He asked what they had. He asked what others were saying. Questions that betrayed concern. Questions that revealed awareness of risk. Investigators noticed how often he deflected toward hypotheticals. How he spoke in generalities when specifics were requested. How he described emotions without anchoring them to moments. These weren't confessions. But they were signals. Stress fractures in a carefully maintained version of events. At the same time, pressure mounted outside the interrogation rooms. The community, now fully alert, began to fracture into camps. Some insisted the arrest was overdue, that the signs had always been there if anyone had bothered to look. Others pushed back hard, warning against rewriting history to fit a narrative. Old friendships strained. Conversations turned sharp. Silence became a statement. Media coverage intensified. The phrase, cold case breakthrough, appeared everywhere, often alongside words like stunning, unexpected, and shocking. But beneath the headlines, uncertainty simmered. Because breakthroughs promise answers, and answers, in this case, were still incomplete. The family watched it all unfold with a mixture of relief and dread. For years, they had begged for movement. Now that it had come, it carried a cost. Each new detail reopened wounds they had learned to live around. Each update forced them to imagine moments they had spent years trying not to picture. Hope, once abstract, now came with consequences. Behind closed doors, prosecutors began to map strategy. They reviewed what they had, what they lacked, and what they could realistically prove. A cold case doesn't just need a theory, it needs resilience. Every assumption must survive cross-examination. Every inference must hold under pressure. And without a body, the burden only grows heavier. They asked hard questions. Could they establish motive clearly? Could they demonstrate opportunity beyond doubt? Could they explain what happened after the disappearance, not just before it? The answers were incomplete, but they were no longer empty. Then came a development that unsettled even the most seasoned investigators. A witness from the past, someone who had spoken briefly in 2005 and never again, came forward voluntarily. Not prompted. Not subpoenaed. Just ready. Time, they said, had changed how they remembered things. Guilt had softened their silence. Distance had given them courage. What they shared was not explosive, but it was precise. They recalled a moment, fleeting and strange, involving the suspect and the victim shortly before the disappearance. An interaction that had seemed unimportant at the time. A tone. A tension. A look exchanged. Something that didn't sit right, even then. They had dismissed it as none of their business. Now, with context, it felt different. This account didn't prove a crime. But it added emotional texture to the timeline. It suggested friction where none had officially existed. It implied a private dynamic hidden behind public normalcy. It gave investigators something they hadn't had before, motive shaped by relationship, not randomness. The puzzle tightened. As word of this testimony spread internally, urgency spiked. Interviews were scheduled. Statements compared. Backgrounds rechecked. Every connection between the suspect and the victim was re-examined through this new lens. Patterns once dismissed as coincidence began to resemble choreography. And still, the absence of physical resolution haunted the case. No location. No recovery. No final proof of what had become of her. The question echoed in every briefing: where did she go? Search efforts resumed in targeted areas, guided by updated analysis and modern mapping tools. Ground once cleared years ago was scanned again. Fields, wooded patches, forgotten corners of the landscape were revisited with new technology and fresh eyes. Each search carried quiet hope, tempered by the understanding that time rarely gives back what it takes. Nothing definitive emerged. But investigators noticed something else. The suspect reacted strongly to news of these searches. His demeanor shifted. He grew agitated. He asked pointed questions. He speculated aloud. He tried to predict outcomes. Behavior that suggested more than casual interest. Psychologists consulted on the case noted the pattern. When individuals are deeply invested in controlling a narrative, any loss of control can provoke anxiety. The reactions, they said, were consistent with someone who felt their version of events slipping. Still, nothing could be rushed. The case now lived in a delicate balance between patience and pressure. Every move had to be justified. Every step documented. Because once charges were filed, there would be no room for error. Behind the scenes, prosecutors and investigators met repeatedly, weighing options, refining theories, stress-testing evidence. They spoke in hypotheticals, in contingencies. They prepared for defense arguments not yet made. They anticipated doubt. And all the while, the clock kept ticking, not toward closure, but toward a moment of reckoning. The town sensed it. Conversations grew hushed again. People watched courthouse doors more closely. Every unmarked car sparked speculation. Every rumor spread faster than it could be verified. The atmosphere thickened with expectation. Because something was coming. Everyone could feel it. The cold case, once buried, was now standing upright, demanding answers. And though no one yet knew exactly how the story would end, it was becoming clear that the version people had lived with for nearly 20 years was no longer sustainable. The past had not stayed buried. It had waited. And now, step by careful step, it was forcing its way into the open, bringing with it truths that would challenge loyalties, rewrite memories, and leave scars long after the headlines faded. Somewhere ahead, a line would be crossed. A decision made. A charge filed. Or a theory shattered. And when that moment came, nothing about this town, or this case, would ever feel simple again. By the time the investigation reached its next phase, the atmosphere around it had thickened into something almost physical. Pressure no longer came only from the public or the media, but from within the system itself. Every decision now carried weight. Every step forward risked exposure. And every hesitation risked letting the truth slip away again. Inside the prosecutor's office, conversations grew sharper, more deliberate. Files were spread across tables, walls layered with timelines, names circled in red. What once looked like scattered fragments now formed a fragile structure, still incomplete, but no longer shapeless. The question was no longer whether something had happened, but whether the case could survive the unforgiving glare of a courtroom. Cold cases die not from lack of suspicion, but from lack of proof. And proof, in this case, remained elusive. The prosecution team knew what they were up against. Years had passed. Memories had degraded. Evidence had aged. The defense, whoever it would be, would have endless room to cast doubt. They would point to contamination, to hindsight bias, to the dangers of retrofitting a narrative onto old facts. They would argue tunnel vision. They would say the investigation wanted a villain, and had chosen one. So the team slowed down, even as the world demanded speed. They began reconstructing not just events, but psychology. Motive, they knew, would be key. Juries need reasons. They need a story that explains why. And in this case, motive was not obvious. There was no clear financial gain. No public feud. No documented threat. What existed instead were subtler forces, resentments, imbalances, unspoken tensions that rarely leave paper trails. Investigators dug into old relationships with renewed intensity. Conversations once dismissed as harmless were re-evaluated. Patterns of behavior were charted over years, not days. The goal was to understand the emotional landscape surrounding the disappearance, not just its physical mechanics. They uncovered hints of control disguised as concern. Of boundaries blurred under the cover of familiarity. Of moments that, at the time, had been brushed aside as awkward or misunderstood. In hindsight, those moments carried a different weight. Not proof of violence, but indicators of a dynamic that could escalate. Meanwhile, the suspect's behavior continued to draw quiet attention. He spoke often now, sometimes too much. He volunteered information that hadn't been asked for. He speculated about theories circulating in the media. He tried, subtly, to shape the narrative, to frame events in ways that minimized his proximity while emphasizing coincidence. It was not overt manipulation, but it was noticeable. Investigators noted the shift. People who are innocent often grow frustrated. People who are fearful grow careful. And people who feel cornered sometimes overcorrect. When questioned again, he leaned heavily on memory gaps. On the fallibility of recollection. On how long it had been. On how unfair it was to expect precision after so many years. All true. All reasonable. And yet, when pressed on specific moments, he grew defensive, even irritated. His tone sharpened. His posture stiffened. It wasn't confession. But it was friction. At the same time, more voices began to surface. Quiet ones. Hesitant ones. Individuals who had never spoken publicly before, now reaching out through lawyers or tip lines. Some offered context. Others offered suspicion. A few admitted they had once brushed aside concerns, because they didn't want to cause trouble. Their statements were imperfect, emotional, sometimes contradictory, but collectively, they added texture. A picture began to form of a man who, in private, could be volatile. Not constantly. Not explosively, but unpredictably. Someone who needed control, who struggled with rejection, who reacted poorly when challenged. These traits alone proved nothing. But combined with proximity, opportunity, and a shifting timeline, they began to matter. Behind the scenes, forensic teams revisited physical items yet again, this time with a narrower focus. Instead of casting a wide net, they searched for confirmation. Corroboration. Something, anything, that could anchor the case to something tangible. Advanced analysis teased out minute details once thought unusable. Patterns invisible to earlier technology began to flicker into relevance. Still, the absence remained deafening. No confirmed location. No recovered remains. No definitive physical scene. That absence haunted every meeting. Prosecutors debated strategy late into the night. Should they wait? Should they risk moving forward? Could they build a case on circumstantial evidence layered carefully enough to hold? Or would waiting only allow doubt to harden, witnesses to fade, and momentum to die? The decision loomed, heavy and irreversible. Outside the legal sphere, the town simmered. Conversations grew more polarized. Longtime friends stopped speaking. Accusations were whispered, then spoken aloud. Some people defended the suspect fiercely, citing years of familiarity, shared history, perceived decency. Others argued that familiarity was exactly the problem, that evil often hides behind routine. Social media amplified everything. Speculation became performance. Armchair detectives dissected timelines, drew maps, built theories. Facts blurred with opinion. Rumors hardened into beliefs. The line between investigation and entertainment thinned dangerously. And through it all, the victim's name resurfaced again and again, sometimes reverently, sometimes carelessly. Her image circulated widely, frozen in time, detached from the complexity of the life she had actually lived. She became a symbol, a headline, a case number, while those who loved her struggled to remember her as she truly was. Privately, investigators worried about that too. About losing the human core of the case beneath layers of analysis. They reminded themselves why they were doing this. Why they had reopened the file. Why they had pushed forward despite the obstacles. Because something about the story didn't sit right. Because too many small details aligned in uncomfortable ways. Because silence, maintained for nearly 2 decades, rarely exists without effort. Then came a turning point, not dramatic, not public, but decisive. A legal threshold was crossed. A determination was made that the body of evidence, while circumstantial, had reached a point where action could no longer be postponed. The risks of waiting now outweighed the risks of moving forward. The case would advance. Internal preparations accelerated. Charges were drafted, revised, drafted again. Language was scrutinized. Every word weighed. Every assumption tested. Prosecutors rehearsed arguments they hadn't yet made, anticipating counterarguments they hadn't yet heard. The decision rippled outward quietly. A few officials were notified. Coordination began. Timelines were set. And then, almost imperceptibly, the tone shifted. What had once been an investigation became a countdown. The suspect sensed it. His behavior grew more erratic. He reached out to people he hadn't contacted in years. He asked questions that betrayed anxiety. He tried to reassert normalcy, to appear unbothered, but the strain showed in small, telling ways. Those watching closely could see it, the tightening jaw, the restless movements, the sudden urgency in his voice. Something was coming. The past, long held at bay, was finally pressing forward with intent. And as the machinery of justice prepared to move, one truth became impossible to ignore. this case was no longer about what might have happened in 2005. It was about what could still be proven now. Because soon, very soon, the quiet reinvestigation would give way to a public reckoning, one that would force every assumption into the light, and ask a question the town had avoided for nearly 20 years. What if the answer had been standing right there all along? The moment the decision was made, everything accelerated. What had once moved in careful increments now advanced with purpose. Meetings that used to end in hesitation ended with directives. Drafts became documents. Hypotheses hardened into formal language. The machinery of the justice system, dormant for years in this case, began to turn with a low, relentless hum. Behind closed doors, prosecutors finalized the framework of their argument. They did not pretend it was perfect. They knew the vulnerabilities. They knew the defense would attack the gaps, the years, the absence of physical resolution. But they also knew something else. The story, when assembled in full, no longer collapsed under its own weight. It held. The charge would not promise certainty. It would argue coherence. It would argue that events, behaviors, and contradictions converged toward a single conclusion. That the disappearance was not an accident. Not a voluntary vanishing. Not a mystery born of randomness. But the result of deliberate human action. When the paperwork was signed, it felt anticlimactic. No speeches. No cameras. Just signatures pressed into paper, sealing a decision that would ripple outward. A date was set. Notifications were prepared. A chain reaction began. The first sign to the outside world came quietly. A sealed document appeared on a docket. Then another. Then a brief, carefully worded notice confirming what many had suspected, but few dared to believe. Formal charges were being filed in connection with the 2005 disappearance. The announcement landed like a shockwave. News alerts lit up screens. Anchors stumbled slightly over their words, careful not to overstate, careful not to understate. Authorities say, according to court records in a long-dormant cold case, the language was cautious, but the implication was electric. The suspect was named. And suddenly, the abstract became personal. A real face. A real address. A real history. The name echoed through the town with a weight that felt almost physical. People repeated it in disbelief. Some whispered it. Some rejected it outright. Others nodded slowly, as if something they had never articulated had just been confirmed. Law enforcement moved quickly. The arrest this time was unmistakable. Public. Procedural. Unavoidable. Patrol vehicles assembled. Officers approached with formality, not urgency, but precision. Neighbors watched from behind curtains, phones raised, hearts pounding. The moment unfolded without drama, yet it carried enormous gravity. Cuffs closed again around the same wrists. This time, there was no ambiguity about what it meant. Inside the station, the mood was controlled but tense. The suspect was processed, fingerprinted, photographed. The routine steps of custody felt surreal in contrast to the years that had led here. A case once defined by absence now had a physical presence, a person sitting in a room, facing the weight of accusation. The charge itself was carefully worded. It did not claim everything. It did not explain everything. It alleged responsibility. It alleged intent. It alleged a crime that had long haunted the community. And with that allegation came a storm. Press conferences were scheduled. Statements drafted. Officials chose every word with caution, aware that this case lived in the public imagination as much as in legal code. They emphasized patience. Due process. The presumption of innocence. But their expressions betrayed the significance of the moment. "This represents a major development," one official said, voice steady. "The result of years of work." Questions came fast. Why now? What changed? What evidence finally pushed it forward? How strong is the case? Will there be more arrests? Answers were partial. Carefully contained. The investigation, they said, was ongoing. Behind the scenes, the defense team mobilized just as quickly. Attorneys with experience in high-stakes cases reviewed every detail. They requested discovery, filed motions, prepared narratives of their own. From their perspective, the case was built on inference, hindsight, and pressure. They intended to challenge it relentlessly. The suspect, now formally accused, maintained composure. He denied wrongdoing. He claimed shock. He insisted the allegations were wrong, unfair, born of desperation rather than truth. To those who knew him, his reaction was familiar, controlled, restrained, measured. But to others, something had changed. The confidence felt brittle. The certainty rehearsed. As days passed, more information seeped into the public sphere. Not official evidence, but context. Old acquaintances spoke out. Former co-workers described uneasy moments they had never reported. Neighbors revisited memories they had once dismissed. Each account added color, tone, unease. None of it proved guilt. But collectively, it reshaped perception. The victim's family, meanwhile, stood at the edge of something they had waited for and feared in equal measure. Relief collided with grief. Validation tangled with dread. The idea that the case might finally move forward reopened wounds that had never fully healed. They spoke cautiously, choosing words that honored both hope and restraint. They thanked investigators. They asked for patience. They asked for respect. And beneath it all, they carried the unbearable weight of expectation. The legal process advanced methodically. Hearings were scheduled. Motions argued. Evidence lists expanded. Each filing revealed small pieces of the state's theory, timelines, interactions, inconsistencies. The structure of the case began to take shape in the public eye. It was not a single smoking gun. It was a mosaic. And mosaics, by nature, require interpretation. Critics seized on that. Commentators questioned whether the case leaned too heavily on circumstantial threads. Defense advocates warned of confirmation bias. They pointed to the dangers of reopening cold cases without definitive proof. The debate grew louder, sharper, more polarized. But investigators remained focused. They had reached this point deliberately. They knew the scrutiny would be fierce. They believed the evidence could withstand it. And still, something else loomed. Because even as charges were filed, even as the legal gears turned, one fundamental question remained unanswered: what exactly happened after the moment the victim was last seen? The timeline still fractured there. The narrative still dissolved into uncertainty. The place, the method, the sequence, none had been fully established. That absence haunted everything. It meant the case would not hinge on a single revelation, but on the cumulative weight of inference, behavior, and contradiction. It meant the story would be fought line by line, assumption by assumption. And it meant the next phase would be the most dangerous of all. Because now, the truth would be tested in public. Under oath. Under pressure. With every word scrutinized, every pause interpreted, every inconsistency magnified. As the court date approached, tension thickened across the town. Conversations hushed. Eyes lingered. The past felt closer than ever, pressing in from all sides. Something irreversible had begun. The cold case had crossed into a new chapter, one where silence was no longer an option, and where the story, long buried, would be forced to speak. And soon, very soon, the courtroom would become the stage where decades of doubt, denial, and delay would collide. The courthouse felt smaller than it should have that morning, as if the walls themselves had leaned inward to listen. Reporters gathered early, murmuring into microphones, scanning every arriving face for meaning. Cameras waited. Not for spectacle, but for confirmation that this was real. That a case buried for nearly 2 decades had finally crossed the threshold into judgment. Inside, the air was tight with anticipation. When the accused entered the courtroom, the sound was subtle but unmistakable, a shift in energy, a collective intake of breath. He looked older than most remembered. Thinner. More rigid. His movements were careful, deliberate, almost ceremonial. He avoided eye contact, focusing instead on the table in front of him, hands folded as if rehearsed. Across the room, the victim's family sat together, close, but not touching, their presence quiet and heavy. Years of waiting had brought them here, to this room where answers were promised, but never guaranteed. Their faces carried something between resolve and exhaustion. The judge took the bench. Formalities followed. The case number was read aloud, its sterile cadence at odds with the human weight behind it. Then came the first moment that truly mattered. The prosecution stood to speak. Their voice was calm, controlled, almost restrained. They did not dramatize. They did not sensationalize. Instead, they framed the story as a sequence of choices and consequences. A disappearance. A long silence. A trail of inconsistencies. A pattern that, when viewed as a whole, pointed to one conclusion. They spoke of opportunity. Of proximity. Of behavior that could not be reconciled with innocence. They reminded the court that time does not erase truth, it only hides it. And they made it clear that what followed would not be a single revelation, but a layering of facts meant to form a coherent picture. The defense rose next. Their tone was sharp, confident, controlled. They challenged the very foundation of the case. They spoke of memory's unreliability, of the dangers of hindsight, of the temptation to fill gaps with assumptions. They emphasized what was missing: no body, no confession, no direct physical proof tying their client to a crime. They warned of narrative overreach, of emotional reasoning, of a community so desperate for closure it might mistake suspicion for certainty. The tension between the two versions of reality settled over the room like static. Then the witnesses began. The first was a procedural one, a law enforcement official who had worked the early stages of the case. Their testimony was factual, restrained. They described the initial search, the lack of forced entry, the early dead ends. They spoke of how the case had gone cold, not from neglect, but from exhaustion of leads. As they spoke, jurors listened carefully, absorbing the shape of a mystery that had resisted resolution for years. Next came analysts and investigators from the later phase. They explained how the case was reopened, how technology had evolved, how old evidence could now be re-examined. They spoke about patterns, about inconsistencies, about the slow convergence of details that once seemed unrelated. They described how the suspects' statements had shifted over time. How timelines changed subtly. How certainty wavered under scrutiny. They did not accuse directly, they presented comparisons, charts, timelines that allowed the jury to see the discrepancies for themselves. The defense pushed back hard. Cross-examinations were precise, almost surgical. They highlighted the absence of definitive proof. They questioned methodology. They raised the specter of confirmation bias. They suggested that investigators, hungry for resolution, had begun to see meaning where none existed. The courtroom felt like a pressure chamber. Then came the witnesses, who shifted the emotional temperature. A former acquaintance took the stand, voice trembling. They spoke of moments they had long dismissed, uneasy interactions, subtle tensions, things that felt wrong only in retrospect. They admitted their own guilt for staying silent, for not trusting their instincts at the time. The defense challenged their memory, pointed out inconsistencies, suggested influence from media coverage. The witness faltered but held firm on one thing, the feeling they'd carried for years that something was off. Another witness followed. Then another. Each added texture rather than certainty. Their stories overlapped imperfectly, like transparent layers that never quite aligned, but together formed a troubling silhouette. The courtroom grew quiet during these testimonies, the kind of silence that hums in the ears. Then came the moment many had been waiting for. The accused took the stand. The decision surprised some, unsettled others. It was a risk. A gamble that control and composure could outweigh uncertainty. He swore the oath, his voice steady, his expression neutral. He spoke carefully, deliberately, choosing words as if placing them one by one on a scale. He denied any involvement. He insisted he had nothing to do with the disappearance. He described his life at the time as ordinary, unremarkable. He emphasized how long ago it was, how memory fades, how easy it is to misremember details after so many years. When questioned about inconsistencies, he explained them as confusion, as natural erosion of recall. When confronted with contradictions, he framed them as misunderstandings. When asked about proximity, he stressed coincidence. For moments, he sounded reasonable. Then the questions sharpened. Prosecutors asked him to explain specific gaps, specific movements, specific statements he had made years apart that no longer aligned. His answers grew longer, more complex. He circled instead of landing. His tone tightened. There was a pause, brief, almost imperceptible, when he was asked about a particular evening. A fraction of a second too long. A breath taken before answering. In a courtroom trained to notice such things, it resonated. He corrected himself mid-sentence. Then again. The room leaned in. The prosecution did not pounce. They let the silence stretch. Let the inconsistency sit in the open. When they finally spoke, it was to ask a simple question that forced a choice between two versions of his story. He chose one. And in doing so, quietly contradicted an earlier statement entered into evidence. It wasn't dramatic. There was no outburst. No confession. Just a small fracture appearing in the surface. But fractures spread. The defense objected. The judge ruled narrowly. The moment passed. But it lingered in the air, heavy with implication. As testimony continued over days, the pattern repeated. Minor discrepancies. Shifting details. Explanations that grew more elaborate under pressure. Each on its own dismissible. Together, increasingly difficult to ignore. Outside the courtroom, public reaction intensified. Some saw guilt etched into every hesitation. Others saw a man unfairly dissected by circumstance. Arguments spilled into public spaces, online and off. The case became a mirror for broader fears, about memory, justice, and how easily narratives harden. Inside, the trial pressed on. Experts testified about behavioral patterns, about how stress can manifest, about how people sometimes reveal more in what they avoid than in what they say. Defense experts countered with research on false assumptions, on the unreliability of retrospective interpretation. It became a battle not just of facts, but of interpretation. And beneath it all, the absence still loomed. No body. No scene. No definitive account of what happened after the last confirmed sighting. The prosecution acknowledged this. They did not deny it. Instead, they reframed it. Absence, they argued, can itself be evidence when paired with action, motive, and deception. The defense rejected that outright. As the days wore on, the weight of the trial settled heavily over the town. People followed every update, every exchange. Some avoided the news entirely, unable to bear the tension. Others consumed every detail, desperate for resolution. The courtroom became a theater of uncertainty, where truth and doubt wrestled openly. And as testimony moved toward its final phase, it became clear that the case would not hinge on a single revelation, but on whether the accumulation of small, unsettling inconsistencies could outweigh the vast, echoing silence left behind in 2005. The verdict, whatever it would be, loomed like a storm on the horizon. And everyone could feel it coming. By the time the trial reached its final stretch, the courtroom felt like a sealed chamber, pressurized by weeks of testimony, contradiction, and unresolved absence. Every seat was filled. Every whisper carried weight. Outside, the town seemed to move more slowly, as if waiting for something to break. The prosecution rose for its closing argument with deliberate restraint. No theatrics. No raised voice. Just a steady tone that carried authority born of preparation. They reminded the jury where this story began, not in a courtroom, but in a quiet home in 2005, where a woman vanished without warning, without explanation, without trace. They spoke of the years that followed, of unanswered questions and stalled leads, of a silence so complete it began to feel intentional. Then, piece by piece, they rebuilt the case the way they had built it all along. They spoke of opportunity, how proximity created access. Of familiarity, how trust can open doors that force never could. Of behavior, how certain actions, repeated over time, form patterns that cannot be ignored. They returned to the inconsistencies, laying them out not as isolated missteps, but as a mosaic of contradiction. They did not claim perfection. They acknowledged the gaps. They named the absence. But they argued that absence itself told a story. A person does not simply vanish, they said, without someone knowing why. They walked the jury through timelines one last time, aligning statements with data, memory with movement. They highlighted moments when the defendant's version shifted, subtly, but meaningfully. They asked why someone innocent would need to revise their story so often. Why details changed only when confronted. Why explanations grew more complex under scrutiny. They spoke of behavior after the disappearance. Of reactions. Of silence. Of choices made in the days and years that followed. They urged the jury to consider not just what was said, but what was avoided. This case, the prosecutor said, voice steady, is not built on a single piece of evidence. It is built on convergence. On the way many small truths point in the same direction. Then they stopped. No dramatic flourish. No plea. Just a quiet return to their seat. The defense stood slowly, deliberately, as if to counterbalance the gravity that had settled over the room. They began with a warning. A warning about certainty. They spoke of the danger of narratives that feel complete simply because they are coherent. Of the human tendency to fill in blanks when answers are painful or absent. They reminded the jury that suspicion, however strong, is not proof. They returned again and again to what was missing. No body. No eyewitness. No forensic confirmation. No direct evidence of a crime. They argued that the prosecution had built a story from fragments, asking the jury to infer intent, action, and outcome from ambiguity. They challenged the reliability of memory stretched across decades. They questioned the motivations of witnesses who came forward late, after media attention reshaped recollection. They reframed inconsistencies as human error. Normal forgetfulness. Stress. The erosion of time. They urged caution. Patience. Skepticism. Reasonable doubt, they said, is not a loophole. It is the foundation. Their final words were quiet but firm. Do not let the desire for closure replace the demand for proof. When they finished, the room exhaled. The judge gave instructions carefully, precisely, each word measured. The burden of proof. The presumption of innocence. The need for unanimity. The difference between suspicion and certainty. The jury listened in silence, absorbing the gravity of what they were about to carry with them. Then, slowly, they rose. The jury filed out. The door closed. And the waiting began. Hours passed. Outside, reporters paced. Phones buzzed. Updates flickered across screens. Inside, the courtroom sat empty, echoing faintly with what had already been said. The victim's family waited in a separate room, holding on to each other, caught between hope and dread. The accused sat elsewhere, guarded, expression unreadable. Time stretched in unfamiliar ways. Inside the jury room, conversations unfolded that no one else would ever fully hear. Evidence was revisited. Notes compared. Arguments tested. Voices rose, then softened. Some jurors fixated on inconsistencies. Others on absence. Some felt the weight of coincidence pressing too hard to ignore. Others clung to the principle that doubt, once present, must prevail. The hours accumulated. Then the door opened. A clerk stepped out, eyes scanning the hallway. A single sentence followed, quiet but electric. The jury had reached a decision. The courtroom filled again in minutes. People took their seats with rigid urgency. The air felt thinner now, charged with anticipation. The accused was brought in, face pale, jaw set. The family gathered, hands clasped. The judge asked the question that carried the weight of years. Had the jury reached a verdict? They had. The foreperson stood. Papers rustled. A breath was taken. But before the verdict could be read, the judge paused, procedural, careful, ensuring clarity, ensuring protocol. Seconds stretched unbearably long. In those seconds, everything seemed suspended. 2 decades of waiting, of wondering, of imagining what might have happened in the dark. And then, the words were spoken. The verdict landed not with a bang, but with a heavy, reverberating silence. Faces reacted before voices did. Shock. Relief. Disbelief. Tears. Stillness. The meaning rippled outward, unevenly, touching everyone differently. Some felt justice had finally spoken. Others felt a door had closed forever without revealing what lay behind it. The judge thanked the jury. The courtroom murmured. The bailiff called order. Outside, chaos erupted, questions shouted, microphones thrust forward, headlines forming in real time. Inside, the weight of the decision settled slowly, painfully. But even now, with a verdict rendered, something remained unresolved. Because verdicts answer legal questions. They do not always answer human ones. As the courtroom emptied and the lights dimmed, a strange quiet took hold. The kind that follows impact. The kind that leaves echoes. The disappearance that began in 2005 had finally reached a legal conclusion, but not an emotional one. The story, it seemed, was not finished speaking. Because even after judgment, even after years of searching and speculation, one truth remained stubbornly out of reach. No one could say, with certainty, what truly happened in the final moments before she vanished. And that uncertainty lingered, heavy and unresolved, waiting to surface again. The verdict did not end the noise. It multiplied it. Within hours, the case that had slept for nearly 2 decades was everywhere again, reborn in headlines, fragments, arguments, and fury. Screens glowed with the same words repeated in endless variations: cold case, unexpected arrest, controversial verdict, each one sharpening the divide that had already begun to widen beneath the surface of the town. Outside the courthouse, voices clashed. Some cried. Some shouted. Some stood in silence, staring at the building as if waiting for it to explain itself. The verdict had drawn a line, but it had not brought agreement. It had not brought peace. In living rooms and late-night diners, in comment sections and call-in shows, the same question pulsed again and again: was this justice? Or was this desperation dressed as closure? The prosecution spoke confidently in press briefings, insisting the process had worked, that the jury had weighed the facts and reached a lawful conclusion. They spoke of accountability long delayed, of patience rewarded. Their words were calm, controlled, rehearsed. The defense answered with a different tone. Sharper. Urgent. They spoke of a system under pressure to resolve a story that had grown too loud to ignore. They warned of precedent. Of narrative overtaking evidence. Of a man condemned not by proof, but by time. And beneath all of it, the same absence remained: the person whose disappearance had started everything, still missing, still undefined, still a shadow at the center of every argument. In the days that followed, details once buried began to resurface, examined with new intensity. Old police interviews were replayed, their pauses dissected. Statements once dismissed as irrelevant were pulled into the light. People who had stayed quiet for years suddenly remembered fragments, half-scenes, uneasy moments that now felt heavier than before. A former neighbor claimed she had heard something the night of the disappearance, nothing clear, just a sound that didn't belong. A co-worker recalled an argument weeks earlier, sharp enough to linger in memory. A distant acquaintance came forward with a story they said they'd never shared, because they hadn't thought it mattered. Each account added texture, not clarity. Each one deepened the fog. Journalists mapped timelines again, tracing movements minute by minute, comparing versions that almost aligned, but never quite locked together. Analysts debated behavioral patterns, body language, motive theory. Some called the arrest overdue. Others called it reckless. And quietly, beneath the noise, doubt began to harden into something more durable. Because when the evidence was stripped of emotion, stripped of urgency, stripped of the human need for an ending, what remained still felt incomplete. The absence of a body was no longer just a legal detail. It became symbolic. A missing anchor. A missing truth. The defense filed motions. Appeals were discussed. Legal language replaced emotional rhetoric, but the tension only sharpened. Each filing suggested that the story was not finished, only paused. That what had been decided in court might yet be undone somewhere higher, quieter, slower. Meanwhile, the town lived inside a contradiction. On some streets, people spoke of relief. Of finally being able to sleep without the weight of an open wound. Of believing, at last, that the person responsible had been named. On others, there was discomfort. A sense that something had been forced into place. That the narrative had closed too neatly for a case built on uncertainty. Old friendships cooled. Long-standing grudges resurfaced. Conversations stopped mid-sentence when certain names were mentioned. The case had not united the community. It had split it along invisible fault lines that had always been there. And still, no one could say what truly happened that night. The house connected to the disappearance sat unchanged, its walls holding years of silence. Investigators had searched it more than once, modern tools probing where earlier ones could not. But time is an expert at erasing. What it doesn't destroy, it distorts. Even the smallest details, an unanswered phone call, a misplaced object, a remembered look, took on new gravity. People revisited their own memories, questioning whether they had missed something, whether they had chosen not to see. The story began to feel less like a case and more like a mirror. A reflection of how badly people want certainty, how uncomfortable ambiguity becomes when it lasts too long. Late at night, documentaries replayed the timeline in hushed narration. Podcasts dissected motives with surgical intensity. Commentators slowed down old footage, freezing frames, circling gestures, extracting meaning from posture and tone. Every analysis claimed to move closer to truth. None of them reached it. Because truth, in this case, had become fragmented, scattered across years, buried beneath interpretation, bent by memory, filtered through expectation. And then, quietly, another development surfaced. Not dramatic. Not explosive. Just strange. A document, long overlooked, reappeared in public discussion. A report that had once been deemed insignificant. It didn't contradict the verdict directly, but it didn't support it either. It introduced a variable no one had fully accounted for. The timing was wrong. The detail small. But the implication unsettling. Experts debated it fiercely. Some dismissed it outright. Others paused, recalculating timelines they thought were settled. The conversation shifted again, subtly but unmistakably. The case, it seemed, refused to stay still. For the family of the missing woman, this resurgence was unbearable. Every headline reopened a wound that had never healed. Every theory pulled her further from the person she had been, reducing her to a symbol, a question mark, a headline hook. They had wanted answers. Instead, they had inherited controversy. For the convicted, the future narrowed into a long corridor of appeals and uncertainty. Their supporters spoke of injustice. Their critics spoke of accountability. Their face appeared on screens again and again, frozen in a moment of judgment that would now define them forever. And hovering above it all was the cold case itself, no longer dormant, no longer forgotten, but not truly solved either. A case suspended between resolution and doubt. Between law and truth. Between what could be proven, and what might have happened in the dark. As months passed, the intensity softened, but never disappeared. The story settled into a low, constant hum, resurfacing whenever new paperwork was filed, whenever an anniversary approached, whenever someone claimed to know something new. And through it all, one question refused to fade. If the verdict was right, why did so many questions remain? And if it was wrong, what had really happened back in 2005, in those final unseen moments before everything went silent? The answers, if they existed at all, remained buried, somewhere between memory and evidence, between belief and doubt, waiting for the next fracture in the story to bring them back into the light. The pressure did not arrive all at once. It seeped in quietly, through margins and footnotes, through late-night filings and carefully worded statements that most people never read. But for those watching closely, something was shifting. The story that had seemed locked in place was beginning to flex, almost imperceptibly, as if testing its own limits. It started with a discrepancy that refused to stay buried. A timestamp. Not dramatic. Not emotional. Just a number that didn't quite agree with the rest. Buried deep in an old supplemental report, one that had been scanned, archived, and largely forgotten, was a notation about a phone signal logged hours later than previously assumed. At the time, it had been dismissed as a clerical anomaly. A technical artifact. Noise in the data. Now, under renewed scrutiny, it looked different. Analysts reran timelines. Independent reviewers overlaid records that had never been compared side by side. And slowly, uncomfortably, a window began to open, narrow, uncertain, but real. If the timestamp was accurate, then one assumption at the heart of the case no longer held. The disappearance might not have happened when everyone believed it did. That single possibility sent a tremor through every conclusion built on the old timeline. Because if the timing shifted, even slightly, then opportunity shifted with it. Alibis bent. Movements overlapped differently. Presence and absence changed meaning. What had once appeared damning became ambiguous. What had once seemed irrelevant suddenly mattered. The response was immediate and divided. Some experts dismissed the issue as technical noise resurrected by overanalysis. They warned against reading too much into outdated systems and incomplete logs. Others, however, leaned in closer. They asked why the discrepancy had never been fully resolved. Why it had been sidelined instead of examined. And once attention returned to the raw materials of the case, more fractures appeared. An interview transcript revealed a line that had been paraphrased incorrectly in later summaries. A phrase softened. A hesitation removed. The difference was subtle, but its impact was not. The original wording suggested uncertainty where later versions implied confidence. Another detail surfaced from an evidence inventory, an item logged, then relogged under a different description years later. Minor, perhaps. But in a case defined by fragments, even minor distortions carried weight. Slowly, a pattern began to form. Not of conspiracy, not of intent, but of compression. Of a story gradually simplified to survive repetition. Of ambiguity sanded down into narrative. And with that realization came a harder question. How much of what everyone believed was the product of clarity, and how much was the result of exhaustion? Because cold cases do not just test evidence. They test patience. They test institutions. They test the public's tolerance for uncertainty. At some point, the pressure to resolve begins to compete with the obligation to be right. This idea gained traction quietly, then loudly. Legal analysts began using cautious language on air. Phrases like procedural vulnerability and interpretive drift entered the conversation. Former investigators spoke carefully, choosing their words with precision, acknowledging that long cases carry long shadows. And then came the interviews. People who had once been peripheral, technicians, clerks, junior officers, were suddenly asked to remember their role from nearly 20 years earlier. Some struggled. Some contradicted records. Some admitted they had deferred to assumptions they didn't fully understand at the time. None of it proved innocence. But none of it reinforced certainty either. The appeal process, once theoretical, now took shape. Motions were filed citing newly emphasized inconsistencies. Arguments were framed not around emotion, but around process.